Tim.
Okay, hello, thank you for the intro, Dave. I am Tim Deere-Jones. I've been working since the 1980s as a marine pollution consultant and a researcher with a speciality in hydrocarbons and radioactivity. I am a graduate of the Cardiff University Department of Maritime Studies, where I did a research dissertation on the sea-to-land transfer of marine pollutants, which I actually carried out the field work for on Flatholm in the Bristol Channel. And during our university education, we did a lot of field work on boat work in the Bristol Channel. So I'm reasonably well acquainted with Bristol Channel environmental parameters. And furthermore, I've done a lot of work in conjunction with Stop Hinkley in the immediate environments of the Hinkley site, including helping to initiate a completely new research project in 2015 when we eventually persuaded the Environment Agency to take radiological measurements from the tidal stretches of the River Parrett. And that tidal stretches of that river runs for 17 miles inland. And as a result of our bullying, the Environment Agency did do a fairly comprehensive survey of the Parrett and demonstrated that it was indeed contaminated with Hinkley-derived sea discharge radioactivity right up to Boroughbridge. And they have then since then incorporated two of the Parrett sites in the regular annual monitoring reports that the Environment Agency publish for that region. Okay, so I also have been working on my side of the Bristol Channel, the Welsh side, to oppose the dump of radioactive of the dredge sediments into the Cardiff grounds, which is just a mile off the seafront of Cardiff. And basically, the thrust of our objections there was that we thought the radiological monitoring of the Bridgewater Bay sediments to be dredged was very, very poor. And we also objected to the fact that they intended at that stage to bring 300,000 tonnes over and dump it into the Cardiff grounds. And they had done no baseline studies to work out where that sediment might be dispersed to, because like the Portishead proposed site, the Cardiff grounds is what they call a dispersal site. That means that it's a place where you can chuck your dredge wastes and it will be dispersed from that site through the wider environment. And so that was a concern, that they had no real idea of where that material would go from Cardiff grounds. And also we felt that the a radiological analysis of the sediment dredge was inadequate, and we were very concerned that nobody was interested in taking a baseline data of radioactivity in the sediments along the Welsh coast before the dump. So there was nothing with which you could go and compare the pre-dump and the post-dump effects of the dumping. So in effect, they were dumping the stuff there, and there were going to be no checks and no follow-up on it. And this is what I am now concerned about, the new proposal to do at Portishead, because we have pretty much the same situation there. Now, I've just about finished writing my consultation document to the Marine Management Organisation, who have put up a public consultation process to be closed on the 26th of March. So I'm going to go through a handwritten summary of that document, which is still being proofread in its typo form. My main concern is, at the basis of this, is the development consent order that was issued to EDF in 2011 to construct the Hinkley C site. And at that stage, they were supposed to have done an environmental impact assessment and an environmental statement covering all the impacts of the proposed development at Hinkley C. Well, that was fine in terms of actually building the thing, but the dredging only got a couple of paragraphs in the ES, and the Cardiff Grounds site, which has been used, was only given a sentence of discussion, and Portishead wasn't mentioned at all. And the worry about that is that the MMO themselves, the Marine Management Organisation criteria for applications to dispose of waste say that you should not only study and quantify a set of polluting determinants in the dredge sediment, that would be chemicals, metals, PCBs, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, and radioactivity, but you should also then compare what you've got in the dredge site to what you have in the proposed disposal sites, so that you can see, are you dredging nasty stuff and putting it into a clean environment or not? Well, none of that was done to the Cardiff Grounds. And as far as I can tell from the documentary search that I've done to date, none of it has been done to Portishead. So we don't know whether the relatively high levels of contaminants, not only radioactivity, but the chemicals and the metals, etc., in the Bridgewater Bay are going to make matters worse in the Portishead area, or keep the equivalent, or indeed go less than the problem might be at Portishead. So those are issues of concern, because you're going to have wildlife and possible human health effects from some of these chemicals if the conditions are not right. So what we have is that MMO has set up a series of site criteria for this whole issue of dumping and dredging, and one of them I've just gone through, but you must identify what pollutants are going in and out. So none of those site assessments for comparison purposes have been completed. And the determinants are known at Bridgewater Bay, at Portishead, so we don't know how much of that stuff there is there. So we can't make a serious and honest assessment of what the impacts of the proposed dump might be there. One of the other issues that comes up from the MMO criteria is that marine management say that if you're going to dispose of something that's seen, it should actually be a last resort. And before you do that, it's very vital that you make assessments of possible alternative uses of that dredge sediment. Now, again, this is something that EDF, in their development consent order and its associated environmental statement, covered in about 5 sentences. They said there were no alternative uses. The stuff they were dredging wasn't suitable for any alternative uses, and they briefly alluded to the fact that because it wasn't sand, you couldn't use it for beach restoration, and that it was the wrong sort of sediment to put on the reclamation site at Sturt Island and Sturt in the Bridgewater Bay, where they're doing a replacement site for land that has been lost at Bristol Docks. Now, I've been through the literature and I found that no, that actually doesn't appear to be true. And there are a series of studies out there that show, number one, that you can use those fine sediments, the muds in particular, which are coming out of the bay, Bridgewater Bay, they can be used for reclaiming and fertilising agricultural land. In time in which you have to wait till the salts to degrade and wash away. But once you've done that, you can turn moderate or low standard agricultural land into very good productive agricultural land. And a prime example of this is to look at Holland and see what they've done on their reclaimed polders, where they've raised the level of the reclaimed polders to some metres above sea land by putting dredge material on them. So that's one very good potential use. A second potential use is for building material. There are studies all across North Africa, and I've referenced these studies in my consultation. There are studies from North Africa where they take the fine sediment and be able to mix it with cement matrices and make very good paving slabs with it, which are strong, have good shear strength, and can be polished and used extensively as outdoor pavements and indeed put into building blocks as well. There are a series of studies from France and China which show that dredged marine fine sediments can also be used as part, mixed again with concrete and cement, as part of the substrates for road building. So in the absence of EDF presenting anything other than a mere 4 or 5 sentences on this issue, I think their case that there are no landside uses for this material is unproved, because they haven't referenced any documents, whereas what I've just been telling you about are fully referenced scientific journals from peer-reviewed journals showing how useful these materials can be. So there's a whole issue there about really, is there any need for them to be disposing of this stuff at sea? But there is one little let out, and if you bear with me now, because the history of the discussions between EDF, English Nature, the Environment Agency and MMO have taken quite a long time to unravel, because there's been a very complicated to and fro. Right at the beginning, when EDF were talking to the Environment Agency and Marine Management Organisation, the original plan that EDF was going to adhere to was to do those dredgings and dispose of the dredge waste within the Hinkley sediment cell, which runs loosely between the centre of Bridgewater Bay, offshore zones outside the Bridgewater Bay, but kind of opposite the Hinkley Sea area, and running up towards Western. So that's, as far as I can identify, the Hinkley sediment cell. And everybody at one stage was in agreement that they would do that. And then, for some reason or another, EDF decided that they weren't going to do that, and they needed to dump it all in the Cardiff grounds, a mile away from the Cardiff city seafront. And when I examined the fine print, I found that the only excuse was that it had been discovered that those sediments no longer met the Marine Management Organisation's criteria for dumping in the Hinkley sediment cell. Now, I've never been able to, so far, uncover which of the MMO's criteria the dredge sediments from the Hinkley, from the Bridgewater Bay, have failed. And I rather suspect that it may well be the pollutant levels, that they didn't want that material broken up and dispersed by dredging and dumping. And I'll tell you why, because Bridgewater Bay is widely recognised by marine scientists and sedimentologists to be what we call a sediment sink. You will be aware of the fact, perhaps, that it's a very, very muddy area. I can't show it to you on screen, but in my consultation, I have a map which shows the Bridgewater Bay as being one area of very intense sedimentation, and most of the rest of the Bristol Channel is sandy, gravelly bottom, or largely sandy, gravelly bottom, whereas Bridgewater Bay is largely fine sediments, muds and silts. And because a lot of pollutants adsorb to the outside of microparticles of sediment, and then so if you think of a handful of mud, you've actually got a lot more surface in it than you have if you've got a handful of sand grains, because you've got all those trillions and trillions of small grains, each of them on the surface, and the multiplied surface area is much greater than the same volume of sand grains have, because there's less airspace between them, and there are less sand grains. So the sediments in fine sediment deposits like Bridgewater Bay always accrue much greater levels of pollutant. So I suspect, and I don't have the proof because EDF don't want to discuss it and nobody's publicised it, that is the reason why the Bridgewater Bay sediments failed the MMO criteria. Anyway, Welsh ministers when the proposal was put to Wales to dump that material in Cardiff grounds, the Welsh Environment Agency had just been closed. The new Welsh Environment and Regulatory Agency, called National Resources Wales, had not yet been. So the decision rested solely in the hands of the Environment Minister at the time. Call it coincidence if you like, but the Environment Minister at the time, one of his previous posts, not in the Welsh Government, but one of his previous posts in business, had been head of the Public Relations Unit for the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority. And he would have been very well acquainted with the EDF group, and he would also have been very well acquainted with those in the Welsh Government who support the proposal for the Walter nuclear power station on Anglesey, and also with those in the Welsh Government who wished to have the Tasmanian nuclear base brought to Wales if the Scots-Nats chucked it out of Scotland. So it's my own personal feeling that there may well have been some sympathy there in the decision-making process. But that decision-making process did not go before the Welsh Environment Agencies. They were given the job of managing it once the decision had been signed off. And then there are some concerns for campaigners about the whole issue of the dredging dump, because in 2011, the original proposal was to dispose of 300,000 tons, to dredge and dispose of 300,000 tons. Wales gave EDF a license to do that at the Cardiff grounds in 2013, and EDF did not take it up. And so the license expired in 2016, and they came back again and asked for renewal, and were granted it for 300,000 tonnes. And then in the event, in 2017, 2018, they only disposed of 120,000 tonnes. So there was a vital, they were making a vital push to get the license and to dump, but then they only dumped less than half. Now they've come back, and they're asking for 600,000 tonnes. So we're really concerned about what is exactly going on here in terms of the volumes, and why is it creeping up? Why have they applied and then only done half, having said it was really important that they were given the license in 2017 so that they could get on and finish? And now they want to come back and they want to do twice as much. So it's beginning to look to us rather suspiciously, particularly in light of asking for a new site, that this is an open-ended process and they can keep on dredging and yet perhaps come back and ask for another 300,000 tonnes or another 600,000 tonnes. At the moment, we see no definitive end in this process. So what happened after they did the 2018 dump? And it's now 3 years since they did that. So they dredged a big pit. And I've worked on a lot of dredging proposals in the past. And I can confirm to you that when you dredge a big pit and then you leave it for 3 years, lo and behold, it will fill again. So this is the problem with them leaving a gap and doing intermittent dredging. So they're going to have to remove another perhaps 120,000 tonnes before they get to the 600,000 tonnes that they're after. So it's a kind of very confusing picture that is being presented here. So look, I'll now move on to some of the more technical issues about the actual pollutant qualities of the mud. And it's very interesting to note that you may have seen EDF's PR stuff that they've got online. And one of the things that really struck out to me in that was their claim that Bridgewater Bay sediments is just like any other sediment in the Bristol Channel. Well, first of all, as I've already said to you, if you look at maps of the material on the seabed of the Severn estuary, you can see that Bridgewater Bay is filled and stuffed with very fine sediment. There is another fine sediment site off the southeast coast of Wales, off the town of Newport called the Newport Deeps. And then there's the muddy intertidal stuff, which is exposed at low tide, which, as you know, is quite extensive. But actually, the rest of the seabed of the Bristol Channel, because it has some of the highest and fastest tides in the world, second only to the Bay of Fundy, is pretty scoured. So it's largely sand, gravel, and bare rock. So first of all, that's a mistake that EDF have made by saying that you know, the silt, the material from Bridgewater Bay is just like anything else anywhere else in the Bristol Channel. And then secondly, in terms of its pollutants, I guess that harbour authorities have probably measured things like anti-fouling in their harbour sediments, but I can tell you absolutely for certain that the knowledge of radioactivity in the Bristol Channel and the Severn estuary is strictly located to relatively small areas either side of the outfalls of the nuclear licence sites. And you will know that there are only 3 nuclear power station sites and 1 nuclear radioisotope diagnostic manufacturing in Cardiff. And so actually the knowledge about radioactivity in the Bristol Channel is strictly limited to those 4 sites. So EDF attempts to reassure us by telling us that the sediments are the same throughout the Bristol Channel, and moving this stuff from Bridgewater Bay and dumping it at Portishead isn't really going to make a lot of difference, are sadly mistaken and without any scientific foundation at all. My researches have noted that most academics say that there isn't actually a division here too, because EDF are saying that they must dispose of the sediments from Bridgewater, either at Bridgewater or in Cardiff, because they must keep the sediments inside the Severn estuary. Well, that makes that you can pass that until you actually look at the majority definitions of what is the Severn estuary and what is the inner Bristol Channel. And the majority definitions have a line running from Lavernock Point on the Welsh side, which is just to the west of Cardiff, to Green Down. And everything upstream of that is the Severn estuary, and everything downstream of that is the inner Bristol Channel. That locates Bridgewater Bay firmly in the inner Bristol Channel, and the 2 disposal sites that we have mentioned, Cardiff Grounds and Portishead, firmly within the Severn estuary. So actually EDF claim that it's important to dump stuff at Portishead or Cardiff Bay or Cardiff Grounds in order to keep material in the Severn estuary. That doesn't stand the test of scientific and academic support either, because Bridgewater Bay isn't in the Severn estuary. And so in effect, from that point of view, what you are doing is actually importing material into the Severn estuary rather than keeping material into the Severn estuary. And as far as keeping material in the Severn estuary is concerned, again, the science tells you that the big river systems, Bristol Avon, the Wye, the Usk, and the Severn River itself are putting over 1.6 million tonnes of sediment into the Severn estuary every year anyway. So the Severn estuary isn't running out of sediment, and it doesn't need any input from an outside area. So that's a very interesting point to look at. Okay, so
Tim, can I just interrupt? Do you have a map of the channel showing the areas that you're talking about that you could put on screen that might help us to visualise? Because
that document is being proofread at the moment, and I don't have it to hand, so I'm reading from handwritten notes. But I will send you a copy of the consultation when it's done, and the maps are there.
Okay.
So sorry, I can't help you now, but in a couple of days when I get it back, I'll send you a copy of the preliminary draft, and you will have the maps. I hope that'll do. Okay, so then the next thing is we come to look at the actual measurements of contaminants in the bay. Now, EDF have used the same contractor all the time to do this work on all of their radioactive sites. It's an organisation called CFAS, which is an agency of the Westminster government, who, as you will know, are pretty pro-nuclear and pretty pro the whole Hinkley development anyway. And CFAS had carried out all of this work. And in terms of measuring chemicals, metals, PCBs, and polyaromatic hydrocarbons, the CFAS protocol uses three kind of action levels. There's below action level 1, was action level 1 and below, and anything that reaches concentrations of those levels is considered to be perfectly safe for sea disposal. And then there's action level 2 or above, and anything that reaches action level 2 or above is considered to be unsafe for sea disposal. But anything that lies between action level 1 and action level 2 is considered to be worthy of further consideration before a decision is made. And that consideration goes back to some of the things I was talking to you about at the beginning. That needs comparison with the background levels at the dump sites, i.e. the places where it's going to be deposited. And having done an extensive numerical breakdown of the sites, I find that 25% of the sample sets actually did not meet, were stuck in the area requiring, of the grade requiring further consideration. But reading all the extensive reports and documentations on this, they have not been given the further consideration because we don't have the data from the dump sites to tell us how much of those pollutants there are there in the dump sites, and find out whether we're going to be making things worse by adding elevated levels through Bridgewater Bay, or whether it's not going to make any difference because it's just as bad in the dump sites as it is in Bridgewater Bay. So all that I found in the reports was, the CFAS reports on this issue was, that because none of the levels exceeded CFAS action level 2, therefore it was safe to dump them. But we haven't had this consideration. So that is an area where the MMO criteria are being broken, and I don't know nowhere in the CFAS documentation can I find them saying that if less than a certain percentage, if less than half, say, of the sediment samples exceed action level 1 and lie below action level 2, you don't have to consider them. And I would have thought that around about 25% of them reaching a level where consideration is necessary, that those particular materials that are at that 25% should be given due consideration. And there ought to be measurements for those levels of stuff in Portishead, from the Portishead site, and we don't have them. So that's an issue of major concern, I think. Okay, so we've also, being involved in the work I have been doing, is I've also looked at the radiological issues, and the issues are much the same there. What we have, we know that Hinkley Point has had over 50 years, it's had 4 reactors discharging very large volumes of liquid effluent containing up to 55 different radionuclides, in slightly different from the 2 stations because one is a magnox and one is an advanced gas-cooled reactor, and they do have slightly different constituents in their discharges because they're using different methodologies to run and cool themselves. But about 55 radionuclides in the discharges day in, day out when the things are running, and that a lot of radioactivity in terms of aggregated radioactivity has been discharged over the years. I mean, I'm talking about millions of gallons of liquid effluent a year and terabecquerels of radioactivity. The terabecquerel is a billion, so it's 1 terabecquerel is 1, and then 12 noughts behind it. So it's a lot of radioactivity has gone into it. And then we find that despite the fact that there are upwards of 50 nuclides probably still there, some of them do have very short half-lives, but others have extremely long half-lives, like plutonium, which can last for half a million years. And we know that Hinkley A, the Magnox, was used partly as a nuclear plutonium factory for the UK and the US nuclear bomb weapons program until the late 1970s and possibly the early 1980s, and then there were peak plutonium discharges in the late 70s down the stacks and up the chimneys. So we know there's a lot of radioactivity there, but despite all of that, the accepted protocols for measuring dredge material for radioactivity involves them only measuring for 2 man-made radionuclides, which are on the gamma emitter spectrum. So they don't include the plutonium, and they don't include things like tritium or strontium-90. They're just cesium and cobalt-60 are the 2 radionuclides that are analysed for by gamma spectroscopy. So that's always been one of my concerns. How can you possibly construct a potential radioactivity dose to wildlife or coastal populations and sea users on the basis of 2 of 50 radionuclides? It's a very speculative thing to be doing. And then I find that actually their methodology for counting the gamma emitting cobalt-60 and cesium-137 consists of only running the counts for 15 hours. And as I've been working on this issue for some time, I'm well aware of the fact, and I have provided, in the past, I've provided the NRW and EDF and the Environment Agencies with this documentation, and I've repeated it in the current consultation that I've written to keep on hammering the same nail in the hope that it gets through in the end. Academics will tell you that actually, if you want the most precise and accurate outcomes of your gamma spectroscopy counting with the smallest or lowest error band, you really want to be counting for 3 days. Certainly 2 days, but 72 hours is the optimum in terms of getting a really good result. So my point being that a 15-hour count is really very sketchy, and when you examine the reasonings behind it, you are forced to conclude that it's in order to save money. It costs a lot of money, and a lot of people sitting down and doing calculations and making sure the whole thing is running properly. So your wages are high, and the cost of running the machinery for 72 hours is obviously a lot more economically painful than running it for 15 hours. So our contention has been since the beginning of this that the 15-hour count is inadequate, and the results you get from it are inappropriate and guaranteed to play, if you like, in the favour of the people who want to carry out the project. And coupled with the fact that they're only monitoring 2 of the gammas and none of the betas, and initially none of the alphas, it just looks like cheap state work. The only benefit is going to accrue to the people who are proposing the project. So I'm not happy with that. And we haven't really had a response to that. We were initially told we had a kind of equivalent to a parliamentary inquiry in Wales, and initially EDF came up and came to the inquiry and claims that gamma spectroscopy would identify, and by using it, they had identified all of the radioactivities present in the mud. And we pressed them about the presence of things that only emitted alpha rays, and they fudged the answer to that. But subsequently, we have been able to push them from the Welsh side to admitting that they would carry out a small amount of monitoring for plutonium and americium, which are two of the several alpha emitters with very long half-lives, which, if you inhale them or ingest them, are extremely damaging, far more damaging to the human system than cesium and cobalt-60. So there we are with that. So after the work that we did in Wales this time, in the spring of this year, there was a consultation about the monitoring. February 2020, there was a consultation process about the monitoring for the radioactivity in the sediments, for the new proposed zone, which was initially going to be Cardiff grounds only, and Portishead wasn't mentioned. At that stage, we submitted again further appeals for the monitoring of alphas, and this time they caved in and they have agreed to do some monitoring for alphas, the plutonium and americium. And so that kind of proved to us that we were right when we said, yeah, the gamma spectroscopy that they were doing wasn't identifying those things. And although they hadn't admitted that we were right, they have nonetheless agreed to do alpha monitoring, and they're now been trumpeting that fact and saying how very advanced they are doing that, and it will now provide data on the presence of plutonium and so on in those sediments. However, they've taken 22 sediment cores, because they want to go down to the seabed through the sediments, and the sediments in places in Bridgewater Bay are 4 meters thick. So they've taken cores of that sediment down to the rock, the bedrock, and analysed them for gamma spectroscopy. And they agreed that they would do 3 of those 22 and analyse them for alpha and beta. But then we find that instead of analysing them for 5 or 6 alphas that we were interested in originally, they've only done 2 of them. And of the betas, there were 3 or 4 betas that we wanted them to analyse for, and they only analysed for 1 of them. And they've chosen their choice from the 22 cores were not the 5 or 6 cores that had the highest level of gammas in them. And the only justification for monitoring cesium-137, or the major justification for monitoring cesium-137, is that it is an indicator of the presence of other radionuclides. So your highest cesium-137 should indicate to you that that's where you may have the highest plutonium. But no, they didn't choose those highest ones. They chose 2 of the lowest ones and 1 of the medium level gamma peaks, and they didn't choose the highest gamma peaks, and so they have not picked up the highest alpha peak. And again, we haven't seen any explanation for that, and this is something that I'm querying through the consultation that I've written now. Okay, so we're just really finding that this whole issue of the monitoring is being done with as little expense as possible, and with not very good science, not very pure, and not very supported by the academic and scientific evidence out there, which is published in peer-reviewed journals. And it's all based on the International Atomic Energy Protocols, and the IAEA is the sort of super agency for the nuclear industry. And as an adjunct to that, I will say that one of its published driving principles is the promotion and the development of nuclear power across the world. So they're not really necessarily the people who you would want arbitrating on these issues of independent analysis. And there is nothing in the IAEA protocols that forbid the UK government or the English government or the Welsh government from setting higher standards and demanding better standards. But they all seem to be reluctant to do this. Okay, so we've got this. We've got this problem here of finding that the analytical work to find the pollutants in the sediments in Bridgewater Bay is not really of the highest standard. And then we have to think about the MMO criteria, which say you need to be able to compare those findings with what you with the sites where you want to do the dumping. I found no evidence that anybody has looked anywhere, either within the Portishead dump site, parts of which are only 500 metres from the coast of north-east Somerset, or looked in the adjacent intertidal sediments or the river estuaries, and you've got a number of river estuaries there, not only the Bristol Avon, but you've got smaller rivers like the Congress, the Yo, the Banwell, the Axe, the Broom running down, and all those big intertidal areas running down towards Weston-super-Mare, which are quite likely to be impacted because, as I read it at the moment, the current proposal is to lump that 600,000 tonnes of sediment laced with radioactivity and chemicals and PCBs and polyaromatic hydrocarbons and dump it into the Portishead dump site on the ebb tide. So that's when the tide is running out. So which end of the Portishead dump site, which you may have seen mapped, it's a longish, thinnish dump site. Which end of it they propose to use, I do not know. But on an ebb tide, if they're dumping there, it seems to be likely that the material will initially disperse off downstream towards Sand Bay and places like that, but is then quite likely to be carried back up upstream again past the Portishead foreshore and the intertidal tracts there on the flooding tide, and the extent of the flood may well carry material past the Bristol Avon estuary, although the Bristol Avon estuary is likely to take quite a lot of that material into itself, and that material will then end up in the intertidal reaches of the Bristol Avon, as well as intertidal reaches of those other rivers that I mentioned, and along the foreshore. Problems with that is, again, the IAEA protocols on all of this say that because you can measure, it's permitted to just measure for the two gammas, and then you make a dose estimate out of what you find out of your measurements, your analytical results for 2 or 50 plus radionuclides, just the gammas, no betas, no alphas. Then you make a dose estimate based on what you call the pathways of exposure. Now, the pathways of exposure, as identified by the International Atomic Energy Agency and subsequently CFAS and EDF and the people who are doing the monitoring, are strictly limited, and they haven't taken note of recent science which has been accrued by academics and independent workers since the 1980s. But since the 1980s, we've become very well aware of mechanisms of the sea-to-land transfer of radioactivity. The water industry itself started a series of projects in the early 1980s on the Cumbrian coast, and there they got as far as identifying that significant quantities of alpha emitters like plutonium and americium and also cesium-137 were actually crossing the shoreline, first of all in sea spray, in droplets, and then secondly, and more of greater concern, in marine aerosols, which is very fine droplets, kind of the sort of quality of fog droplets, which can blow very far inland. And in the marine aerosols, materials like plutonium and americium, which, as I say, are the alpha emitters and very dangerous if you inhale them or ingest them, could be enriched relative to their content in seawater by several hundred times. And cesium was coming ashore at relatively lower enrichments, but in sea spray as well as in the marine aerosols. And this is largely, the alpha stuff is largely to do with micro particles, which get suspended in bubbles bursting at the surf line. And it's actually micro particles of sediment with plutonium adhering to them, and this stuff blows inland. The nuclear industry stopped that work once they had done that particular study, and they never got around to investigating how far inland that effect would last. But contemporary with those studies, they also did studies on what happens when you get inundations, like coastal flooding, and they found that where you have coastal sea-washed pasture, that those could also become highly irradiated at enriched levels when they were flooded by high tides or storm surges, and that then in the following summer, when sheep and beef cattle were grazed on those pasture lands, that the stock ate the grass, absorbed radioactivity, and bioaccumulated it in their systems. And so you had the risk of beef and sheep meat being reared on these pastures having elevated levels of cesium-137, with accompanying implied risk of elevated levels of plutonium and so on. And that if you had lambing sheep on those pastures, then the ewes would pass some of their body burden onto their lambs in utero, and they would pass more of their body burden of radioactivity onto their lambs when the lambs were consuming mother's milk. And so even little lambs would get a bigger dose because the radioactivity would be bioaccumulated in the milk and in uterine fluids.
Tim, we're coming up to 50 minutes.
Okay,
I've got a couple of questions. Can you wrap up in a few minutes, in 4 or 5 minutes?
So what? Yeah. So what I'm just saying to you is that just finalise that business about city land transfer. In a study in Wales, Dyfed County Council did a radioactivity survey of the county of Dyfed, and they found sea-derived, cellar-field-derived radioactivity 10 miles inland on pasture grass, where it was also plainly entering the agricultural food chain, and that was cellar-field derived, and it got round into Cardigan Bay and then blown ashore in onshore winds and penetrated 10 miles inland. Now, obviously, the other concern there is, so we see digestion, ingestion dose taking place from sea to land transfer, but obviously if that stuff is blowing that far inland and it's airborne, then everybody in the pathway between that deposit point who is breathing is getting an inhalation dose as well. So this is why the radioactivity issue is a matter of concern, because if you were to put sediments in to the water column, and the radioactivity is attached to them, then you've got a potential for that stuff to come back to land and impact on coastal populations. So that's the major concern there. So what I am going to be asking the MMO to do is to demand that EDF respond to these concerns by producing the relevant scientific data, in light of the precautionary principle which the MMO quote themselves in respect of dredge and dumping. That is, if you don't have sufficient scientific evidence to clearly say that there is no problem, then you should either acquire that scientific evidence and prove that point, or don't dump. So that'll do it for now, and I'm very happy to answer questions. And I'm sorry if that was a bit rambling, and hopefully when I have the proofread version of the submission, I can send it to you, and any of your colleagues who want to read it can have a peep at it through your good offices. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Tim. So, yes, a few questions, some on the same topic. early on you suggested that instead of dumping the silt back in the channel or the estuary, it could be used in concrete to make paving stones. If it's radioactive though, is that a good option really?
Well, this is a dichotomy, isn't it? Because we are being told by the use of the IAEA protocol that under norm, what they say is they've got a protocol which says, on the basis of the measurements that they're doing, that there is de minimis radioactivity, which means that under norm, there is no radioactivity. And yet you can look at the annual monitoring along the seashore at Hinkley, and every year they report levels of radioactivity of a number of radionuclides. So is it radioactivity? Is it radioactive? In which case you've got to dispose of it very carefully and possibly not chuck it in the sea. Or is it more radioactive? In which case, why can't you be using it for shoreline uses? And I just wanted to add in there that actually I did neglect to mention that during all the discussion between EDF and the regulating agencies, the Environment Agency proposed that EDF make use of a new dump site in the Holme Deeps between Southholme and Steepholme. And I would agree with that as a policy because that is a site which is not within a mile or 500 metres of any coastal communities or coastal zones or terrestrial zones. It's in the middle of the Bristol Channel. It's the deepest water we have in that section of the Bristol Channel, and it's where the currents are fastest and the dispersion would work best. But the issue is it radioactive or is it not? The authority, the EDF is saying, no, it's not radioactive, but then they won't use it for those purposes. And this is what makes me question what criteria did it fail that made them, EDF, decide to not use the inshore, the Hinkley sediment cell, but to take it to Cardiff and dump it there. So there's an unknown there, and I agree with the question, but we are stuck in a dichotomy here, and this is something that I've asked MMO to attempt to sort out for us.
Okay, thank you. Another one is EDF stated in their presentation to Portishead Town Council that the Portishead dump site has recently become available because Bristol Port have reduced their usage. I think you've said that according to the MMO, the site has been disused for some years, but is still open for disposal permit applications. Can you cast any further light on that? Is Bristol Port actually using it or not?
Well, my understanding was, obviously Bristol isn't using it because it's become available for other dumps. And clearly as well as the timescale of Bristol Port not using it. The documentation that I looked at was a couple of years old, and at that stage it was quoted as being not under current use, but not closed. And that's all I can offer you on that one. And I think, the fact that Bristol have no use for it speaks for itself.
Okay. Because the sound quality wasn't very good, I might have misheard this slightly, but did you say that the sediment in Bridgewater Bay is fairly fine, but in the main part of the channel it's scoured and you're down to bedrock a lot of the time because obviously the tides are scouring it out? If that is the case, isn't there a chance that basically the sediment is collecting in Bridgewater Bay, and if they dump it in Cardiff or Portishead, it's going to find its way back again anyway?
Yeah, the sediments in the Bristol Channel and the Severn estuary are all either located all along the intertidal zone, and anyone who drives around those areas at low tides near the sea can see those miles and miles of extensive mud flats, or in two embayments and deeper areas, one of which is the Newport Deep, which is kind of directly north of Bristol, I suppose, on the Welsh side, and the other one which is Bridgewater Bay. And I do apologise for not having the map available, but it is in this document, which I shall forward to as soon as its preliminary draft has been completed. But that map is very plain, and there was a huge project carried out by the Bristol Channel Marine Aggregates Research Group, who were looking for sand and gravel deposits for construction work in the Bristol Channel, and they have done very extensive mapping, and it's quite plain that most of the deep water navigable areas of the Bristol Channel, I'm sure on, or away from the shallow bits up by the two Bristol Channel crossings, are really, the bottoms of them are sandy, gravelly, not without any sediment, but you wouldn't call them sediment, fine sediment deposits, you would call them gravelly deposits with a bit of mud, or sandy deposits with a bit of mud, or pretty much bare rock. And you are quite right. But in the end, that material goes round and round the system, and when those fine sediments in salty water, it's complicated. It's really straightforward, actually, but it's complicated getting into the detail. But in a very straightforward way, you get this process called flocculation occur, which is when saline water holding suspended fine sediments meets fresh water, the electrochemical charges change, and minute small sediments tend to clump together into what are called flocks, and the flocks become heavier than flotation and sink to the bottom. And that typically happens around river estuaries and in the plume of the freshwater plumes from river estuaries, is why the upper Severn has so much fine sediment in it, and why the Newport Deep sediment deposit, fine sediment deposit exists, because it's off the mouth of the River Esk, and the Bridgewater Bay sediment deposit occurs because the River Parrot's there, and the River Parrot brings one hell of a lot of sediment down out of the Glastonbury levels, and you don't have that at the mouth of the Bristol Avon to such an extent, because that river has been canalised and pirated, and the flow has been much reduced. Yeah, so I don't know if that's an explanation, if that satisfies that query or not.
Okay. And the last question we've got on here is, Katie, what political pressure do you think the MMO is under to let EDF have their way?
Well, it does seem, I mean, I don't know, because this is the first time I've had to deal with the MMO. But certainly on the Welsh side, it seems that there was a lot of political pressure from elements of the Welsh government and elements of the Welsh civil service to be extremely helpful to EDF in their attempts to dump the stuff. And not only extremely helpful, but extremely helpful to the extent that, despite massive public opposition in Wales and around parts of the Bristol Channel, manifested through petitions and public, demonstrations outside the Senate and so on and so on. EDF were given their way with very minimal opposition and permitted to come back, ask for another dump, be given it, and that our objections and very intense consultation submissions were submitted, and the now MMO and the Environment Agency and Natural England are all agencies of the Westminster government. It would be nice to think that MMO could be persuaded to listen to Somerset and Avon, and to a slightly lesser extent perhaps Welsh public opinion, should it manifest itself to be concerned about some of these issues. But I would think that behind the scenes there is big pressure on LRO and the Environment Agency and Natural Highlands, all of whom draw their nuclear expertise with which they comment on nuclear matters. They all draw their expertise from the nuclear industry and the departments of universities who fund nuclear research and nuclear training. So it's very hard to find an independent voice, and MMO won't have any MMO in-house experts, just as our National Resources Wales didn't have any in-house experts and had to go to Westminster government agencies for their radioactivity experts. As I say, all of whom are drawn from the nuclear industry. So I think MMO will be under tremendous pressure, but it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that should there be sufficient concern expressed by people on the Somerset side and the Avon side, perhaps up as far as Gloucestershire, and then down through all the relevant areas of South East Wales, that MMO may listen both to a slightly more coherent presentation than I've been able to make tonight, because I'm working from hastily scribbled notes, and considered opinions from anybody else who shares my concerns and the concerns of my colleagues in Wales about this whole issue. Because what happens to you in Portishead will have, as you quite rightly said, because, you know, dumping and dredging, it's not strictly limited to a small area. The effects of that will be Bristol Channel wide. Sure, they will be of greater magnitude at the dump site and at the dredge site, but it will affect all of us around the Bristol Channel, just as what happened, the dump that happened in Cardiff, had an effect on the Bristol Channel, on the Somerset side. It's a unitary system. We've got to get away from this thinking that, you know, what happens in my backyard doesn't happen in your backyard, because the sea connects us all. I think it's important that at the very least that MMO are made, despite whatever political pressure they're under, and as I said, I do think they will be under some, but they should understand that there is a body of concern amongst the population of Somerset about these issues.
Okay. I'm very aware that we're in Hinkley's backyard and certainly downwind of it, where we are here in North Somerset.
You also have the difficult problem that, I mean, we have jobs in Wales which are dependent on Hinkley, and you presumably have a number of jobs in Somerset that are dependent on Hinkley as well as funding for university departments at Bristol, and funding for sports clubs, no doubt, in the various areas around EDF's field of operation. So I mean, they make their connections, and they get their threads and they cast their net quite wide. It's not easy, but I am hoping to initiate. What we really want is for MMO to require an environmental impact assessment specifically for the Portishead dump site, because as I've implied to you, the precautionary principle says if you don't have the scientific data, you shouldn't take the action. And that precautionary principle is enshrined in the opening statements of the MMO mission statement apropos dredging and dumping. It says, in its own words, if you haven't got the scientific information, you shouldn't be doing the work until you have got the scientific information, and you can do the comparisons between the dredge material and the material in the dump site. And you can do the dose estimates, and you can make a study of actually when you dump in a dump site, where actually does the stuff end up? And that's what we want to see. We want to see an environmental impact assessment. And if there's anything that any campaigners on the Somerset side could do, it would be two things. It would be to demand an environmental impact assessment in order to clarify and fill in the scientific data gaps and the scientific don't knows about this project, and to support the call for an EIA, and perhaps to ask for a recall of the whole proposal and have it put before a minister for a public inquiry.
Okay.
Because at the moment they're getting away with it without any having to jump through any hoops in particular. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. You can unmute yourselves if you wish to thank Tim. Thanks, Tim, for your time. And thank everyone for joining us tonight.